Hello, Baptiste. Baptiste Broughton, you are the co-founder of
Hey, Shoaib.
you are the co-founder of Neo-Nomade. We've been knowing one another for years and years and years. You have been there almost from the beginning of the co-working market in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
We had a discussion when we were with the Co-working Europe conference in Paris in 2012, and you were already around and among the best voice or the best authority in France with respect to flex workspace and co-working. And Neo-Nomade moved towards a platform, a service company, which is really accompanying companies with respect to teleworking, home working, and the usage of flex workspace within their portfolio of assets,
Mm-hmm.
workspace assets to operate in a more distributed way. Um, Okay, so can you tell us a little bit more about Neo-Nomade and where you are now after all those years?
Yeah. Yes, it's always a question is when you do you stop being a startup, after how many years
Yeah.
you're supposed to be. But I don't know. We've been here for a very long time. I joined the team a bit later than the original founders, so Nathanael, Mathieu, and Franz Go, who are also very, I think, active founding members of the maybe new way of working community in France, we could call it. And so I think our vision from the start, when we started the company, our vision was that work was going to get more flexible, and it should get more flexible. I guess we were, seeing people commute every day and to go to the office, and thinking that it's a bit of a contradiction, like a major contradiction, I think there, especially in France, where people have to come to the office and they have to be at the office to show that they're working.
Yeah.
And with the development of digital tools, and just in general, just the via internet, the opportunities that we had to work remotely, we thought it was really a shame that people weren't doing more remote work, basically. So we started by helping companies just put in place remote work. So in French, it's called télétravail, so home working or teleworking the other countries. And it goes under a specific, definition in the French labor law. But our job was more consulting to try and help people and companies deal with
Mm.
this in a more efficient way, which is quite a complicated subject, because you're touching on cultural management, on a lot of preconceptions that we have about work, and a lot and about trusting people to work when they're when they're away,
Yeah.
which is a major thing, as I said, in France, with a bit of a cultural aspect on this. Anyway, so we worked a lot on this side, and we still kind of do. And now with the COVID crisis, it's come back in force. This whole need for expertise and consulting to help companies manage this remote work efficiently.
Mm.
But most of the work we did was to implement like proper remote work policies, like structured and well designed policies within the companies, and then roll it out with the teams. So usually you start with a sort of test population, and then you roll it out on bigger populations. And so anyway, so in the first years, that's a lot what we did. We probably helped, I think, about 100 companies over the years to do this. So it's quite,
Mm.
and some of them very big ones. So we were really proud of what we did, in that space of time. And then progressively, the subject got a bit more mature, and we were also working with co-working spaces and just the co-working movement in general, because we were really interested in co-working. And in our vision, we were always thinking that we work more with corporate clients. I think that's one of our specificities. We think that's where also a lot of the like problems are, or the things you need to solve are. Um, when we were seeing like freelance people or startups, and well, I guess in some cases startups the case as well, but they're already in the sort of flexible working
Mm.
environment, and they're able to work from like remotely and stuff, even if sometimes it's hard. We were thinking like our value was really helping like big structures change. So we were very focused on the corporate side, and our vision from the start was that, yeah, home working would be, I mean, when you're working remotely, from home is it's great. You come to the office when you need to, but then you need a sort of third way. You sort of need a third solution between home and the office. And our vision was that, you know, if you leave people, like if you let people to choose freely where they want to work, then, you know, they'll find the best ways for them to be efficient. And so some people will want to work from home, some people from co-working spaces, some people from the office, and your basic week will be a mix of that, you know, like maybe one day in a co-working space, one day from home, and then one day 3 days in the office or something like this. So we were always trying to think about how we could put the co-working element of the flexible working environment into this mix. And so anyway, so we worked a lot with the co-working community, sometimes also doing some consulting, helping them build proper like business plans and you know just structure the project in general. I think we helped about 40 or 50 spaces in that time. We kind of stopped doing that because now the market's a lot more mature, I think. But anyway, so and then progressively we were like, okay, well, there's going to be users like corporate users, and there's co-working spaces. How are we going to get this to work? And a lot of the
You mean
clients were
putting them
saying,
together? You mean that co-working space
yeah, like
become part of
how
the
how
solution?
do you make sure that big corporates are able to use these spaces? For
Yeah,
them it was a bit like co-working was a bit of a freelance thing that they didn't really understand, and it was a bit like something for, like, I don't know, you know
for them.
gen gen Z, Gen Z
Yeah.
people and things. So um and then, yeah, progressively we saw that there was a business case for this, and there was a need for it. It was quite emerging at the beginning, and then it got like a lot bigger as the co-working movement got bigger as well, and companies started to understand it. um and basically we just tried to build the connection between the users and the spaces via the platform. So we partner with all the spaces in France. We put them on the platform, and then companies can roll out the co-working, the sort of co-working booking system for their employees. So they'll say, okay, we have, I don't know, 2,000 people working remotely from home, and then we have 1,000 nomads. There's a lot of business reps and stuff who are on the road, the road warriors, as you call them.
Yeah, yeah.
We're going to give this population this tool where they're able to book a workspace whenever they want, like wherever they want. So that's what we built in the past few years, with the spaces who are, we're actively talking to them every day on one side, and then on the other side, the big businesses, big corporates. So our clients, most of our clients, we have a bit of, independent and like B2C side. You can still go on Neo-Nomade and book a space for an hour with your credit card, but I think 90% of our revenue comes from big corporates. So it's companies like a lot of consulting firms like Capgemini, Deloitte, Bearing Point, Wavestone, like, quite well-established consulting firms with a lot of flexible and quite young people working for them,
Yeah, yeah.
who usually don't have a lot of space at home as well, which is one of the specificities. And then we have a lot of banks and insurances, so a lot more traditional types of businesses, but with some also quite often quite a strong HR policy, trying to care for their workers and keep them engaged. So these companies like Generali or Crédit Agricole, for example, they wanted to offer their remote workers this option, and they realized that when you roll out remote working from home, there's about 15% of people who would prefer to work from a co-working space.
In
So
the total,
we're targeting that.
in the
Yeah.
total staff, when you take 100 people, member of the staff, so what would be the percentage of people who would be allowed to home work, for instance? Is it everybody, or is it just some profiles who are allowed to work from home? Because that's what we see
Yeah.
quite often, that there is really different way to handle it according to either the profile or team you are in. And, we
Mm,
have heard so many examples, especially in the beginning of corporates, where saying, okay, we let our employees go to co-working space, but most of the time they were actually outsiders working on
mm-hmm.
side project or with the internal startup incubator or things like that. So
Yeah.
how does it work? Is it now a policy which is well established and understood by everybody, or yeah, no, we still have to deal with different ways to deal according to the profile or something?
Well, I mean, in a given, it really depends on the company, but in a company, in a service company, there's very few jobs that you can't do remotely. I mean, the, I mean, there are some excuses that are made by companies to say, no, you can't do this, you can't do that. But we're seeing this with the COVID crisis now. There's a lot of, especially in banking, I've been talking a lot to banking companies. There's a lot that were saying, you know, we're in the agencies and we weren't supposed to be able to work from home, but now with the COVID, they gave us access to all the tools. It works, and I'm talking to my clients every day, and I'm doing my job as a banker
Yeah,
from
yeah,
home, and it works. You know what I mean? So
yeah.
of course, if you're in industry or you know customer service, like on the ground customer services, there's things that you can't do remotely. But I think in general, if you take services, most jobs are most jobs that you're doing on a computer, they can be done from elsewhere.
Mm.
I think generally in France, they say it's about 50% of the jobs that you can do remotely. So I think that's a good figure. I think one job out of two is you can do remotely,
Remotable. Yeah.
and yeah, in some companies they will say, you know, it's better for you not to do it because you know, I don't know, it's just like we don't really trust people to be working, or we want the team to
Mm.
be really close together for interactions. It's the
Yeah,
case at
yeah.
Google, for example, where you know they've got all the tools to do it, but there's no there's no remote working policy at Google because,
Of
at least in France.
security and safety. Yeah,
No,
and
it's more. I think it's more a culture thing of being together for interactions and spending so much money in the infrastructures, like you know the offices
yeah,
and
and they pay
you know
for so much
all the
food.
amenities.
Yeah, they pay
Yeah,
for so much food that they don't want to have too much leftovers and waste.
yeah. No, it's hard. You know when you've invested so much in your workplace to be
Yeah,
suddenly saying to people, well, actually, you don't really need to come. You know, like so it's very sometimes it's very subtly permeating the culture,
yeah,
and it's very hard for you to be like, okay, so why isn't this happening? So I think 50% of jobs you can do remotely, probably more as we go on in the next few
yeah,
years.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then within those jobs, not everyone wants to work from home. So the biggest adoption rates we see in companies for remote working before COVID was probably, I think Atos, Alcatel also is one of the big ones. Orange is also very, very big teleworker. I think they've got like 50% of their workforce
Oh yeah,
officially working remotely. That's the problem as well. It's very hard to measure remote work because a lot of it's done unofficially. You know, it's a lot of people saying, "Okay, I'm staying Friday because I need to finish this thing," and then the manager's like, "Okay, that's fine."
yeah. Because
Um,
you put in the statistics the guys who are working on Monday only from home and go to the head office every day, every other day
yeah,
of the week, or yeah, there is. It means that indeed it can be in principle 50% of the people, but it doesn't mean that it's 50% of the time of every staff member
yeah.
accumulated. Yeah,
It's very hard to track. I mean, some companies like Orange have a system where they book their remote working days, and it's all in the sort of in the HR system.
yeah,
But it really depends on the policy you have. Some people it's like every Monday, as you say, but then it's just theoretical. Do they really
yeah,
telework or like remote work on Mondays? Sometimes they have to come in the office. Sometimes they're on holiday. So and then you've got systems where you can pick your day. You know,
yeah,
it's like 2 days a week. Sometimes it's like 8 days in the month, but you take them or you don't take them and it's free. Like, so all this stuff is quite hard to measure, honestly, except in companies that have really structured it. But
yeah,
again, there's also a large part that will go sort of under the radar because they'll do it without putting it in the system and everything. So I think as a general rule, you can see that the biggest users of of remote working in France, they've got about 50%, 50 to 60 max. I think Alcatel is like 60, but it's also quite linked to their real estate policy because they've closed down a lot of sites and stuff like that.
Mm.
But um, anyway, so yeah, I think the big users will be like 50, 60%. And then within that population of remote working, you'll have about 15% of people who would choose co-working over working from home. And that percentage increases as you increase the number of days that are spent remote working. Because if you're just doing one day away, on Fridays, like usually home is
Yeah,
fine. But when you
yeah,
start doing 2 days or
yeah,
3 days or like
yeah.
5 days, like we're doing these days, then people start, there's a bit of a saturation effect. And then people would quite like to do at least a day or maybe a half day in a co-working space and stuff like that. So that's the kind of basic figures that we're seeing. And then when you go into nomads, you get a lot bigger adoption rates. Like consulting firms that we work for, we get adoption rates that are over 30%, just
Uh-huh.
because consultants, like, they need to be like having a space. They come out of a meeting and they want to go to a space, and then
Yeah.
they work from home and it's a bit too, it's a bit too small, and they want to work with their colleagues, so they meet up somewhere in Paris or something. um,
Okay.
so yeah, so the adoption rate of remote working is about, I'd say, 50, 60. Maybe one day we'll see 70%. We're seeing 100% these days. So, everything's
And
possible now.
from
And
the
then, yeah, 15 to
from
30% for co-working, I think.
what strikes me from the example you gave about Orange and Alcatel, and it's still more in the digital industry, isn't it? That indeed we still, that's something what was also
Yeah, but yeah.
feel from numbers that according to the industry you are in, and you were mentioning financial industry, which is growing in terms of adoption, and
Mm,
but still we had the impression that indeed the early adopters was all the guy working in the digital field, and maybe telecom was not that clear, but no, it seems it is.
mm.
So how do you see that differences according to the industry you are in, and how do is the culture changing? You see as well that this is trend, which is, as we used to say, it's more a tide that we see coming rather than small waves here and there and there. But or no, we are still early in the curve.
I think for remote working or for co-working.
Both, both.
Mm. Well, I think for remote working, we thought that we were at the sort of plateau, I think, before COVID hit.
Uh-huh.
I think we were thinking that maybe we were hitting the sort of, maturity sort of level of the, at least in terms of adoption rate. But now that we're seeing the effects of COVID, I'm thinking that maybe we underestimated what the plateau could be.
Yeah,
And I think a lot of companies are switching now, realizing that they can switch to this type of working, where it was, still very hard in the sort of ingrained in the culture that that this type of work wasn't going to be efficient. So I think the natural we had sort of hit the natural sort of level of maturity in France, and then now that COVID's like happening, I think it's just sort of
yeah, yeah,
put the plateau a lot higher up.
yeah.
So yeah, I think on the remote working side, there's still a lot to be done, because we realize that, and I'm seeing this with a lot of, uh, obviously the companies we talk with, they're quite mature on these things because they've put in place policies, and they've, maybe not all the managers at all the levels are very, completely convinced by the thing, but they've got a quite sort of, uh, positive approach to this thing. So
Yeah.
maybe we weren't seeing all the other companies that were really sort of, you know, struggling on this,
Yeah.
and just pushing downwards, so the thing never happened.
But you were not
On the
seeing that.
co-working side, yeah,
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, I just think, just on the co-working thing, I think that even before the COVID crisis, we were far from the plateau. I think it's still something that's very new to companies, even if
Mm.
we've been working on it for like a really long time. We were just very early on the subject. I think a lot of companies are still seeing it from far away, and they're like, oh well, it's interesting, but I don't. My employees don't really ask me for that right now, so why should I do it and stuff. I think there's still a lot of room for growth
Mm-hmm.
for corporate employees to use the spaces, because when we roll it out, we see how well it works, but we also see that it's not, everyone doesn't want to go in a co-working space. So as I said, it's like it's a minority of people who will choose that. It'll be like 10-15%,
Yeah, yeah,
but 10-15% is a lot of people.
yeah,
Like we
yeah.
work with companies that have thousands of remote workers, so we're talking about hundreds of people who are refusing to work remotely because they can't work from home, and they still do the commuting, and they still do the 2 hours in the transports and everything. So yeah, it's a problem. So I think on the co-working side, there's still
Yeah.
a lot of room for improvement, and the fact that the remote working generally, this level of maturity is going to increase with COVID, is probably going to give us also more opportunities for co-working, because there'll
Mm.
be even more people working remotely. So there'll be even more of a need for co-working space in a sort of medium to long term, I think.
Yeah, we had a discussion with guys from Russia last week, and
Mm,
we arrived almost to the conclusion that the co-working offering and available capacity was way too low to address the probably growing demand in the coming future, especially outside big metros, where
mm,
indeed that's where it's the most needed. If we figure out that the driver will be indeed the fact that you can avoid to commute up to your head office to Paris or Lyon
mm,
or Munich, and that's to some extent there was still a huge empty field that needed to be filled in order to address this rising demand. But well, I was going to ask, as the employee from the company, ask actively for being able to work from the co-working space, or now you start to see companies anticipating the demands or the need that is maybe
mm-hmm.
not always
Um,
expressed and told by the people, so they can put in place some schemes that can indeed allow the employees to have solutions,
yeah,
third places as we call it.
it really depends. Sometimes, I mean, you see some people who on their own they will ask for it, or sometimes they'll even pay for it. We see a lot of people who go to co-working space and pay from
Yeah,
their own pockets, or they do a request to get reimbursed and stuff. So I think there are people who are asking for it. What we've seen a lot is quite. I think I'm thinking about two of our clients, at least maybe three, for who the co-working space was like it was like an internal challenge from employees, where they were like, how can we improve your like work-life balance and stuff, and people came out with ideas, and the ideas got voted up,
yeah,
and then the best idea got funding from the company to try a pilot phase.
mm,
So that's a way for it to come from like bottom up, but then it's sponsored by the company, because at some point it needs to come to decision makers and be like, okay, this is strategic. We need to spend money on it, because it does cost money. If you're not downsizing your real estate on the other hand, which
yeah,
I think companies should, that's what we're advising people to do,
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah,
companies to do,
sure,
is try to
yeah,
see the equation globally, but it's quite hard for companies
yeah,
to come to that kind of level of broad reflection anyway, so, and decision making. But anyway, so we've seen a lot of it come from people, but we've also seen companies who thought about it and were like, okay, that their home wasn't going to be an ideal place for them to work from, which is something that we're seeing a lot as well with COVID. Sometimes it's just not the best place for you to be working,
yeah,
even if you don't want to come to the office and avoid the commuting. So they were seeing this in the surveys that they were sending and in the pilot phases and stuff. And then they were like, okay, so what solution do we have? Oh, there's co-working, but how do we do co-working? It's complicated. There's 1,000 spaces. They're all different.
yeah,
How do we partner with 1,000 spaces? So that's when we come in. That's where we come in, and usually we build a sort of custom network for each company. So we don't take all the 1,000 spaces depending on what kind of level of service they have and locations and stuff. And that works quite well. And then, but yeah, I haven't seen at the moment, except maybe a couple consulting firms, companies where they really there's like someone at the top, like HR and real estate, and they're like, okay, you know, co-working is important. We need to put it in the mix, and then we'll downsize a bit our like normal real estate, and we'll really invest in this because it's just like workspace on demand, and we can just like use it. We can pay for it when we use it, basically, not just pay for it because it's there, you know.
And
So yeah.
what are what is the bottleneck still? Because that's exactly the kind of chicken and egg kind of discussion we have been having for years now.
Yeah.
Saying, okay, that's on paper, it looks so obvious that you can shrink your surface. So I don't know if you have seen this statement from the CEO of Barclays Bank, who was saying, yes, now that my people are working from the kitchen, I think everybody in at the headquarters is a model of the past. And that you start mentioning the statements and the awareness that we could see at the highest level, that COVID is bring that on the table. But on the other end, in Belgium, for instance, where we are, we already got some demand like that. We saw companies saying, okay, we would like to have that kind of distributed network of spaces. And the issue was that what you mentioned, the diversity of the spaces, and that they couldn't. There was no way yet to figure out a standard which was similar everywhere. And also to find the right compensation model that allowed all the spaces to be compensated fairly, and not just because, of course, always the issue we had is, or you see that, and we're discussing with guys in Asia as well about that. So the guy in Hong Kong will always get 80% of the people, whereas the guy in, I don't know, Chiang Mai in Thailand will be maybe 5% of the audience. And the way to compensate it and to manage the demand was pretty difficult. Or do you see that handle that, for instance?
Well, I don't know. I mean, on our side, so what we do is we don't define a price we just let spaces define their own price, and we function with companies on a sort of average price level. So we will say, like, you've got, the spaces in this area, the average price is about, I don't know, 25 euros a day. And, you'll have part of it in the suburbs, which will be cheaper, and some of them in Paris. But overall, the general volume is going to average out to about this price. So we define we define more a sort of a budget with them. Then the employees have a user credit that they can use, which is daily or hourly. And then, once the credit is spent, they can't spend more. So it's a way for you to sort of manage your budget. But I mean, so that works quite well for the sort of the whole compensation side. But I think you really need. I mean, I say this because that's what we're doing. Since I'm selling like they say in French, I'm selling my soup. But
it's a good soup.
Yeah, no, I think it's a useful soup to have, because at some point I think you need someone to be actively sort of structuring that for the company. So you need someone who's like a professional of co-working solution for like corporate people. And because when we roll it out to clients, it's not plug and play. You have to, like, train people, managers and like admins, and you have to really work on communicating well on how this thing is going to be rolled out, and then you test it, and then you analyze it. Sometimes it doesn't work. Like we've had some failures sometimes, and you need to understand why. You need to boost the program. You need to come in the offices, if we still have offices after this, we'll see. But and stand with leaflets at the bottom of the elevator, and talk to people about what this new option that's available to them, because it's very new to people. So anyway, you need someone to be actively selling and sort of changing companies for this to work. So that's why the things we do also on the whole remote working side is quite complementary to the co-working thing, because if people aren't able to work remotely, they're not going to come to co-working spaces, you know. You need to change the organizations, and then
Yeah.
co-working can happen. But I think I'm asking myself the same question, to be honest. Like, you know, I've been working on this for a really long time. I think it's a really very interesting and very passionate about this whole subject, and it really changed the way people work. And I think it's useful. I think that's why we're all kind of still, you know, trying our best to bring things to this ecosystem.
Mm.
But I think you have to be realistic as well, in the way that, yeah, not like co-working. Not everyone's going to choose a co-working space to work remotely. It is a minority thing. So for it to work on a massive level, you need a massive number of companies working remotely and integrating co-working in their mix. You
Yeah.
can't just have like 3 4 big companies that do it and then the market thrives from that. You need a mass effect. I
Mm.
think one of the things that could happen that would work very well, and there are some things that are coming out with COVID, is state subsidies, or like subvention, things that they would help companies
Do
gain
you believe
from
it?
this.
Do you believe in that? Because in France or in Belgium or in Spain,
Hmm.
in Germany, I think as well, there has been this support and public funding of some space, especially in the countryside. And it's
Hmm.
true that most of the time there was, yeah, there were quite often lack of professionalism, or the space were too
Mm,
small, or they couldn't become really sustainable after a while, because indeed the public funding was definitely covering most of the cost. There was no real incentive to improve the offering. Also,
mm,
higher standard customer, or companies which had higher standards in mind in terms of how they should host and shelter their employees. Because we have been through that as well, and it has been useful to some in the beginning, for sure.
mhm,
But now that indeed we are speaking really about co-working and third places, third workplace as an alternative to the traditional office model, with the head office model.
mm, mhm,
Um, there is a hard time just explaining the authorities that it's not about just the freelancers and the startups anymore.
mm.
If you even had some real startups in some of the small cities in the countryside, so how do you still think that it can trigger something there?
Yeah, but I think not on the co-working side. I think, like, not funding co-working spaces. I think what needs to be funded, or at least sort of, maybe tax cuts or something,
Yeah.
is for companies. It's like, if I can prove that, for example, that X% of my workforce is working remotely and working from co-working spaces, then I don't know, I get a tax cut, because I'm not using, the public transports. I'm not polluting as much. I'm not, maybe risks of, like, health risks with the COVID crisis. So
Mm.
I'm more thinking of things that would help us go to companies and be like, look, this subject is interesting. First, because it's going to make your workforce more happy and more efficient, which is very linked, and is sometimes a bit hard to convince people, about, unfortunately. And it's also going to make you save money, because the weight that you're putting on the general infrastructure is lower by the fact that you've put in these policies in place. It's the same with ticket restaurant, for example.
Mm.
The vouchers that you have in France to pay for your lunch,
Yeah.
they work also. Like, a lot of it's worked because the state has put a tax cut with this. So if you're giving this to your employees, you can reduce the taxes that you're paying, or something. I'm not very sure about the mechanics, but
Yeah, it's a compensation.
that's how it works. And then you've got private companies. Yeah, yeah, and then private companies will come in, and they'll operate it, and they'll use that that breach, or that, you could call it like this, or that mechanism, as a way for them to sell easier the solution. And that's how it works, I think. So I think that's something that could be done. But it's not the only. I mean, it's not the only thing. I think in terms of, yeah, in general, in terms of law, for example, in France, they've put in the mobility plan, so every company needs to have defined a sort of a whole sort of system
strategy.
of
Yeah.
yeah, helping people move around with co-sharing, like sharing cars and all this stuff. But it's like it's not enforced at all. It's just like we tell you to do this and you could be fined one day, but
Yeah.
nothing's done about it. So that's also the thing. I think the state could help us move to that direction.
Yeah,
But
they don't connect the dots that much, that they have this plan for mobility that is mandatory for companies, as you said. There is those voucher for like tickets to restaurant, for lunches for the employees, for instance. But
mm,
altogether, it lacks that kind of broader vision that we could really move all the model and shift it massively toward this idea of a more distributed workforce than what we have today. That's somehow what you are saying now.
yeah, yeah. And I think, unfortunately, I mean, this crisis, I think, is gonna force them to think about it a bit more. I think we were talking a lot to different um, public institutions at the moment about okay, so if we want to not overcrowd transports after the 11th of May, could we not and because we also want to help co-working spaces, especially the small
Mm,
ones, survive, because I think there's a big risk at the moment for especially small spaces to die out from this crisis, and then we won't even have the capacity to have people work from there if they want to avoid commuting. So I think there's a big turning point now, and unfortunately, yeah, the state has been a bit behind on this. So they took the subject in France with the whole um, mission that was launched on third places
mm.
to see how they could
Yeah, there was a big report about that.
yeah. So which was good, but at no point did it really come on the subject of how could we help the spaces get more revenue from, especially
Yeah,
from corporate clients and from employees.
yeah.
We're always talking about spaces and then the state, and then the users at an individual level, but no one's really talking about how do you go and convince the HR lead of
Yeah,
Danone to give us 10% of his remote workforce and put it in
yeah,
co-working spaces. And I think that would be a lot more intelligent way. And we're talking to a lot of spacers saying this. So they're saying like, don't fund us, just send
yeah.
us more business.
Exactly.
That's
That's
yeah,
that's not dealt through a business mind, and too much from the idea that we just need spaces in remote locations. And that we had that discussion with Wojo at Coworking Europe in Warsaw
hmm
last year.
yeah,
They spoke. They are part of this team in France, I think, about third places. And it's
yeah,
true that the challenge is definitely that there is a sustainable demand for that is there, and not just that there are crappy spaces in the countrysides that where just a few people will go, and that won't last once you start to cut the subsidy for it, and that's a challenge likely.
yeah. No, but it's true. Like small spaces in rural areas is complicated, but there are some models that are emerging that are interesting. There's one in France called Relais d'entreprise,
Yeah,
which is quite interesting. There's and there will be some who are not profitable and who are just sort of also run by people who are have another activity on the side, and I think that that's also good. But
yeah,
I think if we can make these big corporate players part of, like, in general, part of the demand and grow that demand, I think it's great. I mean, I think it's one of the solutions. And I think that's the one aspect on which we're focalizing, our work a lot.
yeah.
But it's a long process. Maybe COVID has sped it up a bit, but it's a long process convincing companies on these things. When we talk to a business today about co-working, it takes us about a year or a year and a half to, to sell it properly.
Wow.
So you gotta be passionate. You gotta be, a bit crazy.
Yeah.
But once it's rolled out,
Well
it's
capitalized
really
as well.
cool. Yeah. So yeah, so that's where we are at the moment. So now our focus at the moment is trying to see how we can get as many spaces back on the platform as open
Mm,
and having a bit of a checklist to make sure that the level of service and security and health measures are taken. Have a bit of a baseline on this. So that's I think that's the main sort of work at the moment, and then trying to get companies back. And because we stopped all the bookings on the platform when the thing happened, we were
mm,
like,
mm,
okay,
mm,
it's
mm.
this, the government says this, let's just like freeze everything. And one of the things we're seeing that's quite interesting with our big clients is that quite a lot of them are saying that they have new sort of users for co-working, new sort of candidates for co-working who weren't remote working, or who were remote working like a couple days a week max, and now they've really fed up with working from home for 6 weeks or seven, and they're saying, and they have like proper problem with breakdowns and
Mm, mm, mm.
the psychological cost of all this crisis on people is going to be pretty heavy, I think. And we are seeing companies are saying like, yeah, maybe actually not just yet, but soon we'll be able to open it, and maybe in specific cases and with a lot of questions of security and everything, obviously, to sort out beforehand. But I think this could create also a new opportunity for co-working spaces to get new members in, because yeah, there's if we keep on this sort of remote working for another 3 months or something, at some point, we have to get people out of their homes.
Yeah.
And I think if we're able for them to you know to go to a space that's 5 minutes from their place instead of commuting 2.5 hours with loads of people, I think that's still less of a risk than making them commute back to the office.
Sure.
So yeah, so that's what we're working on at the moment.
And you see demand from them? Do you
Yeah.
see that it's positively reacting, or it's just for the moment something on paper?
No, it's on paper. I mean, it's companies saying we have that, we've identified these problems and we think this could be a solution, but we haven't decided yet what the solution is going to be, and if we're going to, like press that button.
Mm,
Um, they're quite worried at the moment. They're working on how we're going to organize our own spaces. They want us to, with the co-working communities, that's what we're working on at the moment, to produce a sort of a checklist that's going to be viable. In some cases, we might have to apply the company's own checklist in the spaces, which makes it quite tedious and complicated sometimes. But some companies use a small number of spaces, so you're able to do it. But for the ones that are using the whole network, it's going to be impossible. So we're just going to be like, okay, we've got this checklist, and we've made it like the best way we could, and I don't know, 70% of the spaces um, respect it, like
mm.
have validated it. Um, we'll open bookings only on those spaces as of this date, and let's do it. Let's go for it. I think that's the sort of pragmatic approach that we're trying to take for like you know June, probably end of May, June, hoping to get you know business back into gear, and then probably September is going to be the best way. And then we also have quite a lot of requests for private spaces, private sort of serviced offices. And we do that as well because, sometimes clients tell us we don't want to book it for a day. We have a team of 30 people. We want them to be there for 6 months.
Mm.
So we're also trying to work on this to bring um, that type of more stable business as well to come to the spaces before
It's
the
more
bookings can
brokerage.
happen again. Yeah, a bit like brokerage, more yeah type. So yeah, I think our goal is to get as much, we want to get as much requests and as much flow and volume through as quickly as possible, but we also want to be sure that it's done in a secure and safety first kind of way. So we've had a lot of talks internally in the team, where we were like, how do we present co-working? And you're tempted as a startup or as a company to be overly positive or optimistic about it, just because your kind of own survival depends on it.
Yeah.
But in our case, we're a bit like, okay, we'll put this forward, but only if we're 100% sure that we're not doing it just to just to sell. We're doing it because we think it's useful, and the security, the basic and like security levels are respected. So we're trying to do this in that way. But it's we've never had to think about this before, so
Yeah, yeah.
it's quite a new one.
All right. So to conclude, so you seem quite optimistic in the way that you really see that the COVID crisis has somehow broken a wall
Yeah.
in some people's minds with respect to remote working and digital working, and next step being indeed that co-working options becomes also something on the radar.
Mm.
That's how we can conclude it. That indeed you and from the contact you have with your clients, you feel that something is happening there.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it has made something shift profoundly in the way we work, and I think it goes in the same sort of direction as what we were thinking at the beginning, with more freedom to work remotely and
Mm,
everything. So I think that in a way, all crises present opportunities. They're it's a way to reshuffle the cards and redefine the way we want to work. So I think there's a big opportunity there, and co-working can definitely play a big role. The risk is that with the economic crisis, co-working spaces die out, which would be terrible.
yeah,
Companies don't have the money to invest in these things, and they sort of, crumple back on themselves and don't invest in these things. And the risk is that these things and the transition phase is too violent, or is too brutal for the new model to emerge. So I think that's kind of the question now: is how do we maintain some kind of activity while we're preparing for this new model, and then how do we rebound from there, and are able to take as much as we can from this opportunity for the co-working community. So that's the whole challenge I think we're seeing at this point. I hope the state's going to play its role.
mm,
I hope companies are going to be, visionary and look far into the future and think about these things well. But who knows? Like,
yeah,
I
yeah,
think I'm quite an optimistic person, so I'm optimistic about these things in general. I want to be optimistic. I think if you're optimistic, you're also making good things happen. But who am I to tell? Like, I'm just seeing one little bit of the puzzle, and I hope I can contribute as best as I can. And at least if that's not enough, then at least I won't have any regrets. And I think as a company, we will have tried to
yeah.
work as best as possible. But yeah, I think there is reason to hope and to work and to still work, even if it's remotely, for a better future.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Baptiste, for this chat.
You're welcome.
We wish you all the best. Stay safe in the Berry,
Yeah, thanks.
in the central France, and
Yeah,
give us some news and as soon as possible. Like, we hope we will get out as soon as possible, all together, safe and long life
with
co-working.
with pleasure.
Thanks a lot. Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.
Bye bye.
Bye, Jean-Yves.